Hey guys! Tonight we wander into a world that smells faintly of boiled cabbage, musty carpet, and the ever-present scent of someone else's laundry. You trudge up the creaky stairs of a 19th century boarding house, a place where wood groans beneath your weight, and the air is just a shade too cold, like it's permanently holding its breath. The curtains are faded, and the wallpaper peels in curling strips that make the walls look like they're quietly plotting their escape. You probably won't survive this without a tiny twitch in your curiosity, because the secrets these walls hold are far more scandalous than the smell of boiled cabbage would suggest. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop a comment with your location and local time? It helps me imagine you here with me, tiptoeing through the echoes of this forgotten world. The front door slams behind you with a sympathetic thud, and suddenly you are acutely aware of every creak, every whisper of a draft under the door. Each step brings you deeper into a world where strangers live cheek by jowl, sharing meals, gossip, and the faint hope that love might bloom between coughs and clanging dishware. You shuffle past a row of coat hooks where hats and shawls hang like soldiers on parade, each one marking a story you'll never hear aloud. It is exactly as cramped and uncomfortable as you imagined, but there is a strange charm in that chaos, a rhythm to the constant comings and goings. You catch a glimpse of a young man fidgeting with his sleeve, a woman smoothing the crease of her skirt, and the two of them exchange a glance that seems both hesitant and infinite. Historians still argue whether boarding houses actually facilitated genuine romantic connections, or if they simply served as temporary prisons of polite boredom where the heart wandered at its own peril. A scent of baking bread drifts from the kitchen, blending with the faint tinge of ink from yesterday's letters, now drying in the hall. Someone coughs politely somewhere behind a door, and you realize this building hears more than it says. Each floor is a stage, each room a theatre of quiet tension. You brush past a tiny lobby where a chipped vase holds an assortment of wildflowers that someone, probably secretly, tried to make perfect. Your fingers graze the wood banister and it shivers under your touch, as if whispering a welcome and a warning simultaneously. You notice a puddle of morning rain glimmering on the floorboards, reflecting light like a miniature lake, tempting you to think about romance as both fleeting and reflective. And there, tucked between the shadows, you feel it. The promise that in this dusty, drafty building, human hearts are quietly plotting against decorum itself. The landlady's voice calls softly from somewhere above, a mixture of admonition and habit, and you imagine she has already observed your entrance, catalogued your intentions, and decided if you are a threat or a potential story. It is not a glamorous welcome, but it is intimate in a way only a shared discomfort can be. You trudge past a row of doors, each one likely concealing a story of yearning, mischief, or a late-night confession meant to vanish like steam into the drafty air. Somewhere nearby, a cough and a laugh collide, reminding you that life and love have a habit of making themselves known, whether the world approves or not. You pause, taking in the smell, the creaks, the warmth of bodies hidden just behind the next door, and feel the odd mixture of dread and anticipation that marks the very beginning of your boarding house journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the dining room, a cramped rectangle of worn wooden tables and chairs that have absorbed generations of spilled tea and half-whispered secrets. The air smells faintly of porridge and candle wax, and as you pass, you notice the slight tilt of a chair, as if it has been nudged by invisible elbows of past conversations. Across the room, a cluster of boarders shares a communal breakfast, their murmured greetings threading through the clatter of spoons and the scraping of knives on plates. You probably won't survive the awkwardness without wincing at the constant negotiation of space. No one here owns more than a few inches of privacy. So before your curiosity pulls you too deep, remember to watch your step. Someone's elbow might just be plotting a collision with your ribs, You slide into a vacant chair beside a young woman in a faded blue dress, her hair pinned neatly, but with one rebellious curl escaping, giving her a look of careless charm. You notice her hands twitch as she folds and unfolds a napkin, and you wonder what secrets her fingers have carried over the years. Across from her, a man clears his throat, stealing glances that are polite yet full of longing, like a soldier checking the wind for enemy movements. Historians still argue whether these small gestures, the tilt of a head, a fleeting glance, a borrowed salt cellar, were deliberate acts of courtship or merely accidents magnified by the intense proximity of shared living. You feel a pulse of something akin to anticipation ripple through the room, like static before a storm, and you realize that in these modest halls everyone is both actor and audience. The landlady glides past in her apron, eyes sharp, lips pursed, silently grading the decorum of each diner. You catch the faint rustle of a handwritten note being passed under the table, its contents as fragile and combustible as the morning light filtering through grimy windows. Laundry lines sway outside, visible through the open sash, and you imagine them as a stage where skirts and stockings perform a quiet ballet, each flap and flutter a message of attention or warning. Someone coughs a polite ritual of acknowledgement, and a ripple of giggles moves across the table, almost like a secret language. Only a few are allowed to understand. You notice a small ledger tucked under the salt shaker, a trace of the landlady's bookkeeping perhaps, but it feels as if it also catalogues whispered promises, minor flirtations and tiny betrayals. Your attention drifts to a crack in the floorboards where a coin has settled, dulled with age, and you imagine the countless hands that have brushed past it, the casual touches that sparked silent questions of desire. The smell of coffee grows stronger, bitter and warm, and you feel it coat your tongue as if imparting courage or perhaps just mild alertness. Someone leans forward to share a story about a fellow boarder, their voice low and conspiratorial, and you notice how ears perk, shoulders lean, and the air thickens with curiosity. The dining table, with its mismatched chairs and uneven cutlery, becomes a stage of small theatrics, polite laughter, shy smiles, and the kind of tension that makes the mundane feel like high drama. You catch a stray toast being made over the clink of a spoon, and it carries with it the silent hope that maybe, just maybe, a glance or a gesture today will blossom into something far longer than breakfast. Now you fold your hands quietly, noticing the smell of fresh bread mingling with yesterday's ink and the faint perfume of the woman beside you, and you sense that this morning ritual, though ordinary, is the heartbeat of boarding house romance, a rhythm of attention, longing, and whispered potential that you can't quite escape, even if you tried. The parlour is warm, but not in the way you might hope. It's filled with the collective heat of several women, each wrapped in shawls and prim propriety, sipping weak tea that smells faintly of bergamot and resignation. You trudge over, trying not to trip over the corner of an embroidered rug that has seen better centuries, and settle near a lady whose fingers dance nervously over her needlework. The air hums with soft chatter, the kind that seems innocuous until you realize it is actually a carefully choreographed battlefield of judgments, alliances, and strategic observation. You probably won't survive the subtle power plays without noticing the way eyebrows arch, like miniature catapults, hurling silent critiques across the room. So, before you get too comfortable, imagine each word as a potential dagger or lifeline. History has a funny way of hiding drama in the domestic. You watch a young woman adjust a ribbon in her hair and glance quickly at the corner of the room where a newcomer sits, hands folded demurely, eyes darting. Every sigh, every cough, every careful sip of tea is a coded message. Historians still argue whether these gatherings genuinely nurtured friendship or merely reinforced a hierarchy of subtle manipulations and whispered rivalries. The embroidery itself tells a story, half-finished samplers of flowers, animals, and occasionally hearts stitched in secret colours, as if the needle were a spy for hidden affections. Somewhere beneath the polite veneer, alliances form over shared disdain for the landlady, shared hopes for favourable glances, or secret sympathies for the shy boarder who blushes near the piano. You notice the faint scratch of a quill on paper, and a note, folded with meticulous care, slides across the table under a teacup, catching your eye before it disappears toward its intended recipient. In that simple gesture, the full drama of boarding house politics emerges, a mix of longing, mischief, and careful strategy. One woman leans toward another, whispering a comment about a boarder's manners, and the tip of a smile hints at amusement and maybe jealousy. Even the air smells conspiratorial, a mixture of lavender, damp wool, and faintly burned candle wick. Across the room, a slightly older lady sips tea while eyeing a younger boarder, calculating the social worth of her alliances. The discussion drifts from the latest church sermon to who received the nicest gloves from a travelling cousin, each sentence layered with subtext. You feel the rhythm of the room, a steady pulse of observation and minor theatrics, like a soft drumbeat guiding every glance and gesture. Somewhere, a fan flutters in slow, deliberate arcs, adding to the sense that even the smallest motions are part of a choreographed play. As you adjust your seating and notice the subtle patterns of influence and flirtation, the parlour feels alive with quiet ambition. The scent of tea, embroidery, and nervous anticipation envelops you, making it clear that in this lady's domain, romance is less about grand declarations and more about tiny, almost imperceptible exchanges, smiles caught mid-bite, brushes of hands, whispered approvals or disapprovals. Every gesture has weight, every glance a consequence, and you sense that boarding house life is less about the building itself, more about the intricate dance of human desire, diplomacy, and gentle rivalry that occupies every available inch of space. You wander upstairs, guided by the scent of smoke and polished wood, and find yourself in the gentleman's smoking room, a small, dim space, heavy with the aroma of cigars, pipe tobacco, and faintly oiled leather. The chairs are deep, the kind that swallow a man whole, and you notice the floorboards groan beneath each hesitant step. You probably won't survive this room's quiet intensity without acknowledging the unspoken rules: puff in rhythm, nod approvingly, and never, ever appear too eager. So before you sink into a chair, remember that here, confessions are traded as casually as cards in a game of whist, and missteps can ripple far beyond the smoke ring hovering in the air. Men sit in small clusters, glasses of brandy in hand, sharing stories of their travels, minor business victories, and occasionally whispered secrets about the ladies downstairs. A young clerk leans forward, voice low, recounting an awkward dinner conversation he had with a boarder 2 floors below, while another, older gentleman, chuckles knowingly as if recalling his own past entanglements. Historians still argue whether these rooms served as genuine spaces for camaraderie, or whether they were stages for performative masculinity, where reputation and rumour mattered far more than friendship. You notice the subtle play of posture and gaze, crossed legs signalling authority, a tilted head hinting at interest, and fingers drumming lightly on the table as if impatient with propriety itself. A tiny wisp of smoke curls toward the ceiling, catching the light from a nearby window, and you feel the room's atmosphere settle over you like a soft, heavy blanket. There is an odd intimacy here, born of shared stories, fleeting glances, and a mutual understanding that the floor above is bustling with lives and secrets that are only partially visible. Someone mentions a woman's laugh from the parlour downstairs, and it's as if the name itself carries weight, threading desire, respect, and the tiniest hint of mischief. You realize that in this smoky bubble, every conversation dances on the edge of confession and performance. A leather-bound ledger lies open on a side table, its pages full of neat handwriting detailing debts, payments, and, tucked between the lines, small notations about boarder behaviour: who arrives late, who lingers in corridors, who appears unusually cheerful after breakfast. These scribbles, almost invisible, tell a story of subtle observation, a quiet vigilance that borders on obsession. Even the clock ticks in measured intervals, marking not just time, but the rhythm of anticipation, the waiting, the planning, the plotting of future encounters with the ladies downstairs. You lean back, inhaling the rich scent of smoke mixed with polished wood, and notice a small portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. A forgotten hero, or perhaps the original owner of this house, staring down as if aware of the delicate games unfolding in his absence. It is in these spaces, shadowed and intimate, that the essence of boarding house romance unfolds. Subtlety, anticipation, and a careful balancing act of observation, desire, and restraint. Every puff, every whispered word, every glance carries meaning, like signals in a language you're just beginning to learn. The hallway upstairs stretches before you, a narrow corridor lined with doors of varying hues, some freshly painted, others faded to a dusty pink or chipped cream. You trudge along, the floorboards creaking underfoot, each groan echoing like a minor accusation. Who's intruding? Or perhaps who dares to listen? You probably won't survive a full tour of these private chambers without noticing how the very air seems charged with expectation, the hushed potential of unseen meetings and whispered confessions. So before you knock on any door, pause for a moment and listen. Each knock, cough, or muffled laugh tells its own story. A door swings open slightly, revealing a glimpse of a young woman sitting by the window, her hands clasped over an embroidery hoop. The sunlight catches her hair, turning it to a soft burnished gold, and for a moment, the mundane, faded wallpaper, scuffed floorboards, and the faint smell of yesterday's meals seems to melt away. Across the hall, a young man peeks around his doorframe, glancing down the corridor as if timing a fleeting encounter. Historians still argue whether these chance meetings were truly romantic sparks or simply the result of cramped living and shared schedules. You can't help but notice the precision with which glances are measured. Letters are slid under doors and shy smiles are exchanged like contraband. From a nearby room drifts the faint sound of a piano, its notes slightly off-key, but full of earnestness, like a heart trying to communicate through music. You imagine a young boarder, perhaps practicing for an audience he doesn't yet have, hoping that someone, anyone, will notice the delicate wobble in a treble note and interpret it as charm rather than mistake. There's something almost comical in the way he taps the keys, hesitating at intervals, and you suppress a grin at the thought of centuries-old nerves manifesting in the same way we still do today. A feather-light knock interrupts your observation, and a folded note slides under the door, sealed with a ribbon of deep crimson, the colour of attention, or perhaps warning. You notice a pair of shoes neatly lined beneath one doorway, polished but small, hinting at the occupant's daily care, pride, and silent ritual of preparation. A faint whiff of lavender reaches your nose, and you realize the corridor itself carries the invisible residue of personal choices. Soaps, perfumes, and the faint scent of courage mixed with apprehension. Someone coughs quietly from the end of the hallway, and you can almost feel the invisible threads of connection stretching between rooms, linking lives that overlap yet remain distinct. The shadows in the corners seem to lean closer as if to eavesdrop, holding on to secrets that will never be entirely revealed. A small bell tinkles from the stairwell, signaling the arrival of mail, or perhaps the landlady herself, her presence always a careful balance of authority and curiosity. You watch as a letter is retrieved and delivered with minimal ceremony, but you know that within that envelope may lie hope, confession, or a carefully worded expression of longing. In this hallway, every minor sound, every flutter of fabric, every quick glance is a negotiation, a subtle courtship, a shared joke, or the beginning of a friendship that might last a lifetime, or vanish with the next storm outside. And as you trudge past each door, feeling the pulse of possibility in the worn carpet beneath your feet, you sense that this corridor, narrow and understated, is the true artery of the Boardinghouse's secret life, carrying whispers, glances, and the tiniest sparks of human connection from room to room. You pause at the staircase landing, where the faint smell of wax and dust mingles, and listen. The house seems to breathe around you, every creak and sigh a subtle announcement of presence. You probably won't survive the intimacy of this space without feeling the weight of countless footsteps that have passed before yours. Soft slippers, heavy boots, hurried scurries, and the occasional tiptoe of someone avoiding notice. So before you step down, take a quiet moment to sense the layering of past and present, the invisible actors still lingering in the corners. Descending carefully, you notice a pair of boarders lingering near the railing, speaking in hushed tones that oscillate between amusement and nerves. Their eyes dart toward the parlour below, where the smell of afternoon tea drifts faintly upward, carrying with it the unmistakable rhythm of domestic routine mixed with anticipation. Historians still argue whether these pauses on the stairs, the fleeting glances, the whispered greetings, were intentional flirtations or merely natural consequences of the building's design. You catch a faint blush on the young man's cheek as the woman beside him tilts her head, eyes sparkling with amusement, and you realize that even a staircase landing can become a stage for romance. At the bottom of the stairs, the carpeted hall stretches toward the library, its door slightly ajar. The scent of ink, aging paper, and lemon polish reaches you, and you imagine countless fingers brushing against leather-bound tomes, each leaving a trace of personality and longing behind. A slip of paper flutters out from beneath the door, carrying a secret message that might never reach its intended recipient or might ignite a quiet scandal. Someone coughs in the hallway, the echo bouncing softly off the walls, as if the house itself is holding its breath. You notice a shadow moving behind a curtained window, the vague outline of a face peering toward the street, waiting or watching, and it reminds you that the world outside continues indifferent, while inside these small dramas unfold with delicate gravity. You glance into the sitting room where a chessboard sits neglected, pieces mid-game. Two boarders, engaged in conversation, ignore it, yet the position of the knights and bishops seems almost poetic, a silent reflection of strategy, patience, and calculated risk. The faint tick of a clock punctuates the conversation, and you notice how gestures, pauses, and slight shifts in posture carry as much meaning as words. Someone reaches for a cup of tea, and the liquid sloshes faintly, spilling barely a drop. Yet it draws a quiet laugh from the observers, small disruptions magnified in the intimacy of shared life. In the corridor beyond, a window opens to a garden, sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting shadows that move like dancers on the floor. You catch the glint of a ring on a young woman's finger, the subtle adjustment of a cuff by a man beside her, and the way the space between them seems to shrink and expand with each unspoken exchange. Even the air seems charged with possibility, carrying scents, sounds, and unspoken desires across the rooms, creating a quiet network of connections. You trudge along, sensing that every nook, every landing, every passage in this boarding house is imbued with history, emotion, and the soft, careful weaving of romances that no outside observer could fully chart, a secret world tucked neatly between wallpapered walls and polished floorboards. You slip into the library, and the heavy scent of parchment and polished wood greets you like an old friend who knows all your secrets. The room is dimly lit, sunlight only daring to touch the tops of the shelves, dust motes floating lazily in the narrow beams. You probably won't survive long here without feeling the almost sacred hush that hangs in the air, the unspoken understanding that ideas, glances, and even small acts of mischief carry weight in a place devoted to quiet contemplation. So before you settle into an armchair, notice the way the books lean slightly as if whispering their own judgments, the faint scratch of quills, and the careful folding of letters that may or may not be read aloud. A young boarder sits at a table near the window, cheeks flushed from concentration, copying passages from a favorite novel. Every so often she glances up, eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to notice her dedication, or perhaps her hesitation. Historians still argue whether the library functioned purely as a sanctuary for intellectual pursuits, or whether it also served as a subtle theatre for courtship, where glances across stacks of books could communicate more than words ever could. You watch a gentleman cross the room, casually adjusting his waistcoat, fingers grazing the spine of a leather-bound volume. His eyes flicker toward the young woman, and you feel the delicate tension of a silent conversation, a signal, a challenge, a possibility, all bundled into a single glance. Somewhere in the back, a faint giggle escapes from behind a row of shelves, a sound almost stifled but impossible to ignore. You realize that the architecture itself, the tall shelves and narrow aisles, encourages stealth, secrecy, and the thrill of being caught, or not. A piece of parchment slips from a book, landing near your feet, bearing a hastily scribbled note, "Meet me where the ivy climbs." The simple instruction carries with it centuries of boarding house romance logic, where courage and curiosity are intertwined with fear of embarrassment or censure. A faint breeze drifts through the open window, rustling the pages and carrying with it the scent of roses from the garden outside. You notice the pattern of shadows on the floor, shifting as if choreographed to mirror the subtle dance of human interaction within these walls. A scholar at a corner desk adjusts his spectacles and mutters a quiet observation about a recent social visit, while a young woman laughs softly to herself over a private memory, perhaps the same one that inspired the note you found. Even the clock on the mantel seems to tick with a conspiratorial slowness, marking not hours but moments pregnant with possibility. You take a careful step toward the shelves, running a finger along the spines of books as if feeling the pulse of history itself. Between the pages lie secrets, first crushes, nervous confessions, small victories and defeats that might never reach the outside world. A stack of returned books sits at a table, a few slips of paper peeking from between chapters, each one a breadcrumb trail leading to unseen meetings, whispered words, and careful flirtations. In this space, every gesture, every cough, every adjusted sleeve is magnified, amplified by the silence, and charged with meaning. The library is not just a repository of knowledge, but a quiet stage for human hearts, learning to navigate desire, patience, and the delicate art of connection. You wander toward the back of the library where the shelves grow taller, more imposing, and the light dims into a gentle amber. The air is cooler here, carrying a faint scent of ink, must, and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the fireplace across the hall. You probably won't survive a full exploration of these corners without noticing the almost magnetic pull of secrecy, the feeling that every shadow might conceal a letter, a gaze, or a whispered promise. So, before you step further, slow your pace, lean in, and let your ears catch the slightest shuffle of paper, the faint murmur of suppressed laughter, the tiny gasp of someone discovered mid-thought. A slender figure crouches between two shelves, an open book on her lap, scribbling furiously in a small notebook. Her pen hovers occasionally, hesitating as if she's wrestling with the right words to capture a moment that has already slipped past. Historians still argue whether these private writings were simply exercises in literacy or miniature confessions, secret scripts meant to be read by nobody or perhaps by the one person daring enough to risk curiosity. You notice the corner of a folded note tucked under her knee, the seal broken and edges frayed, suggesting repeated readings, careful memorization, and perhaps a slow, burning anticipation of a reply. Across the room, a young man shifts in his chair, pretending to examine a thick volume while his eyes are clearly drawn toward her. There's a precision in his movements, subtle enough that an inattentive observer might miss it. The slight clearing of his throat, the smooth adjustment of his collar, the careful positioning of a hand to block an unguarded view. You can almost hear the silent dialogue passing between them, a conversation of glances, gestures, and unspoken hopes that doesn't require words to flourish. A small bell from the front of the house tinkles faintly, and the sound seems to make them both jump slightly, a shared acknowledgement of being momentarily caught in the act of living. A low laugh drifts from somewhere behind a towering bookshelf, breaking the tension, a reminder that even in the quietest corners life persists. You catch the flicker of a smile, the subtle tilt of a head, and the way shadows on the floor appear to bend toward each other, as if the room itself conspires in the slow, deliberate unfolding of romance. You notice a small stack of postcards on a nearby desk, each one depicting distant landscapes or famous buildings, tiny worlds outside this building, and you wonder how many of these images were shared as tokens, exchanged in hope of inspiring conversation or connection. A clock tick punctuates the quiet, marking not just the passage of time but the rhythm of anticipation, the pauses, the intervals, the moments that stretch impossibly long yet vanish in an instant. You brush your fingers along the spine of an old volume, the embossed lettering worn smooth, and feel the weight of past boarders who, like you, navigated these aisles with careful attention, cautious hope, and just a little mischief. Every creak of the floor, every flutter of a page, every shifting shadow contributes to an invisible web of connection, a map of desire, curiosity, and the unspoken art of noticing. In these back corners, the boarding house's heart beats quietly, slowly, and with a gentle insistence, reminding you that love, even in whispered or hidden forms, thrives in the most unassuming spaces. You drift toward the parlor at the front of the house, where the afternoon sun filters through lace curtains, scattering patterns of light and shadow across the worn carpet. You probably won't survive a proper tour without noticing how even the furniture conspires to create intimacy. A faintly tilted chair suggesting someone has been nervously rehearsing a conversation, a settee perfectly placed for accidental shoulder brushes. So before you settle, take a moment to breathe in the faint scent of polished wood, old leather, and a hint of something floral, perhaps the remnants of a lady boarder's hurriedly applied perfume. A small group of boarders gathers near the fireplace, exchanging books and small objects with the unspoken understanding that every movement carries meaning. Historians still argue whether such gatherings were social necessities or subtle stages for clandestine courtship, each gesture choreographed by habit and human desire. You notice a young man offering a book, the corner of a page carefully marked, the gesture almost ceremonious. His companion receives it with a tilt of her head, fingers brushing his for just the barest fraction of a second, and a soft smile passes between them, quiet yet loaded with significance. From the piano in the corner, a hesitant melody drifts through the room, offbeat but charming. The player glances up now and then, catching eyes across the parlor, and you realize that even mistakes carry weight here, turning uncertainty into subtle allure. A faint cough from the doorway signals the arrival of the landlady, her presence both a reminder of boundaries and a necessary facilitator of these gentle rituals. She moves with practiced awareness, carrying a tray of teacups, and for a moment you imagine that she sees more than she lets on, a quiet guardian of the boarding house's many secrets. The sunlight catches the glint of a locket lying on a table, the delicate chain hinting at care, and the promise of private sentiments shared in letters or glances. A folded piece of paper lies beside it, bearing a simple message in a careful hand. Meet me by the garden gate when no one is looking. You can almost hear the subtle thrills of anticipation in the quiet rustle of the curtains and the soft shuffle of slippers across the floor. Someone sips tea, oblivious to the tension around them, while two others share a quiet joke, their laughter suspended in the warm, still air, like a bird caught mid-flight. Across the room, a young woman leans back into her chair, legs crossed just so, fingers nervously adjusting the folds of her dress. Her eyes flick toward the open window, toward the street beyond, or perhaps toward the one person whose presence makes her pulse quicken. The arrangement of chairs, rugs, and low tables, mundane in any other house, here serves as a subtle stage, guiding gestures and glances, amplifying the significance of minor interactions. You trudge along the edges of the room, sensing the careful choreography of intimacy, the gentle negotiation of courage, and the almost imperceptible dance of attention, curiosity, and desire that turns the parlor into a silent theater of boarding house romance. You wander down the hallway toward the breakfast room, and the faint aroma of coffee and fresh bread teases your senses. You probably won't survive a full morning here without noticing how even routine meals are loaded with silent opportunities. A strategically placed chair, the careful passing of a butter dish, a glance that lingers just long enough to spark a conversation. So, before you take a seat, let your eyes wander across the room. The worn tabletop, the polished spoons, the faint, chalky traces of sugar spilled by an earlier breakfast. each a tiny marker of life in motion. A group of boarders occupies the far end, their conversation soft but animated. Historians still argue whether these shared meals were designed to foster community or to create a subtle arena for social maneuvering, where alliances, friendships, and small flirtations could quietly unfold. You notice a young woman carefully spreading jam on her toast, while the man opposite her waits for just the right moment to ask a question, his hand hovering near his teacup, in a display that seems casual but is carefully orchestrated. There's a tension in the air, almost imperceptible, that magnifies each small gesture into something significant. A cat, belonging to one of the boarders, slinks between chairs, brushing against ankles with deliberate timing, prompting suppressed laughter and playful swat. Its movements, though independent, seem to serve as a social lubricant, breaking the ice and giving nervous participants an excuse to glance, laugh, or touch. An almost mystical agent of connection in the quiet art of boarding house romance. A nearby window opens to the garden, the scent of dew and blooming flowers drifting in, mingling with the smells of cooked eggs and toasted bread, layering the morning with an olfactory richness that heightens awareness, memory, and subtle emotion. Someone clears their throat, a faint note of authority or attention, and the room adjusts slightly, a chair nudged back, a napkin folded differently, a smile stretched a little wider. A folded letter rests unnoticed beside a teacup, edges soft from repeated handling, carrying a message meant only for the intended eyes. You watch as fingers brush over the paper almost imperceptibly, a signal that someone has recognized its importance, the careful choreography of private communication playing out amidst the ordinary ritual of breakfast. Across the room, a small stack of sheet music sits next to a tray of condiments, hinting at previous performances or lessons that might have doubled as social theatre. A young man hums a tune under his breath, seemingly absent-minded, yet his eyes flick toward a familiar face with a barely perceptible intensity. In this space, the ordinary act of eating becomes a subtle game of observation, anticipation, and social navigation. Every glance, gesture, and shift in posture communicates, connects, and conspires in the quiet, delicate web of relationships that defines the boarding house, a world rich with human curiosity, affection, and the slow, cautious unfolding of intimacy. You wander toward the garden, the afternoon sun warming your skin, and the scent of freshly turned earth mingles with flowering shrubs. You probably won't survive long here without feeling the magnetic pull of open spaces in a boarding house, where walks and chores double as social exercises, where the clatter of watering cans and the shuffle of feet become a soundtrack to subtle flirtation. So, before you step onto the gravel path, notice the way shadows bend along the flower beds, how the leaves tremble in the breeze, and the faintest brush of petals against leaves, tiny, unplanned touches that can feel monumental in this microcosm. A pair of boarders is bent over a small rosebush, exchanging tips about pruning, their hands occasionally brushing over one another. Historians still argue whether gardening in boarding houses served primarily as a productive task or as a socially sanctioned opportunity for proximity and conversation, where one could practice the delicate art of attention without raising eyebrows. You watch them, noting the subtle rhythm of interaction, a careful word here, a deliberate pause there, a shared laugh that hangs in the air longer than it should. Even the cat from breakfast patrols the edges of the garden, weaving between legs as if in silent commentary, reminding everyone that movement and presence are never neutral in these spaces. A trellis supports a tangle of ivy, and someone has scrawled initials on a hidden beam, a delicate declaration of fondness, easily missed by the casual observer. Your fingers brush along the rough wood, imagining the whispers, the stolen glances, the secret appointments it has witnessed over the years. A watering can tips slightly, spilling a splash of water onto the gravel, and a stifled giggle follows, nervous, delighted, and unmistakably human. You realize that these mundane accidents, whether a dropped glove or a mislaid note, become small catalysts for connection, sparks that ignite interactions carefully calibrated between boldness and decorum. A young woman perches on the edge of a fountain, watching a leaf float in the water, her thoughts hidden behind a faint smile. Across the path, a young man approaches, hands tucked behind his back, pretending casual intent, while his mind rehearses 100 small gestures, each designed to elicit the desired response. The sun catches the glint of a ring, a bookmark, or perhaps a note folded in the hem of a sleeve, turning the ordinary into a stage for subtle intrigue. Even the rustle of trees overhead feels orchestrated, amplifying the drama of minor movements, making each glance, each pause, each shuffle feel like a deliberate message, encoded in the silent language of boarding house romance. You take a slow breath, noticing the birds in the hedges, the hum of bees among the flowers, and the quiet heartbeat of the house beyond the garden gate. Every footstep on the gravel, every tilt of the head, every tucked-away smile contributes to the living tapestry of connection, awareness, and expectation. Here in the garden, the world expands beyond walls, offering space for courage, hesitation, and the slow dance of human curiosity, intimacy, and playful strategy. A reminder that even in the smallest interactions, the seeds of romance can take root and flourish in the most ordinary of settings. You find yourself in the sewing room, where the afternoon light spills across wooden tables cluttered with fabric scraps, spools of thread, and the occasional abandoned needle. You probably won't survive more than a few minutes here without noticing how the hum of a sewing machine, the rhythmic click of scissors, and the faint rustle of fabric create a quiet backdrop for delicate observation. So, before you settle at a table, take a moment to inhale the mixture of lavender sachets, damp cotton, and faintly worn wool, scents that somehow make the room feel both industrious and intimate. A young woman leans over her stitching, careful yet deliberate, each stitch an exercise in patience and focus. Historians still argue whether these sewing sessions were primarily practical chores or a socially sanctioned way to sit in proximity to potential suitors, creating a space where conversation could flourish under the guise of productivity. You notice a young man at the opposite table, ostensibly threading a needle, though his eyes wander with precise calculation toward her, catching the faintest hint of a smile as their fingers brush over shared materials. There's a subtle choreography here, a rhythm of awareness, anticipation, and the careful management of appearances. Pinned to a bulletin board are scraps of paper, some bearing small sketches, others little notes in delicate handwriting, messages of encouragement, tiny riddles, or invitations to meet in quiet corners. You trace a finger over one, imagining the shared glance that followed its placement, the suppressed giggle that came from a clandestine reading, the thrill of minor secrecy that defines so much of boarding house life. Even the tiniest gesture, a tilt of the head, a flick of the wrist, can carry layers of meaning, a vocabulary of subtle flirtation crafted over countless afternoons of careful observation and careful restraint. A sewing basket topples slightly, spilling a colourful array of threads, prompting a flurry of movement as hands reach down to gather them. In that instant, a glance is exchanged, fingers brush briefly, and a silent acknowledgement passes between them. Here, in this small accident, intimacy is both sparked and acknowledged. A cat wanders in, as if drawn to the minor commotion, rubbing against ankles and prompting another shared laugh. You note that even interruptions, fallen needles, spilled fabric, wandering animals, become opportunities for connection, a reminder that chance, humour, and minor mishaps play a central role in the unfolding of boarding house relationships. Across the room, a window opens onto the courtyard, sunlight catching the dust in lazy beams, highlighting the quiet determination etched into every face, every hand, every stitch. Conversations meander between gossip, practical advice, and veiled inquiries about one another's schedules, intentions, and affections. In this room, work and play, caution and daring, secrecy and revelation intertwine seamlessly. Each stitch, each gesture, each passing smile becomes part of the subtle tapestry of connection, crafting a slow, deliberate romance where attention, curiosity, and the quiet thrill of discovery are as carefully cultivated as the fabric under your fingertips. You step into the library, a narrow room lined wall to wall with towering shelves, the air thick with the mingled scents of ink, aging paper, and polished wood. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how silence becomes a subtle stage, how the careful placement of chairs and reading lamps encourages proximity and interaction under the guise of studiousness. So before you approach the long oak table, let your eyes drift over leather-bound volumes, over the faintly crooked spines that hint at frequent handling, and over the soft flicker of candlelight reflected on gilt edges. A young man peruses a shelf of poetry, fingers tracing the embossed titles, while a young woman selects a novel from a neighbouring row. Historians still argue whether libraries in boarding houses were intended merely for intellectual cultivation, or whether they doubled as socially sanctioned arenas for quiet flirtation, where one's choice of literature could reveal temperament, wit, or subtle personal inclinations. You notice the way their eyes meet over the tops of books, the smallest tilt of a head signalling curiosity or amusement, the almost imperceptible adjustment of posture to draw nearer without crossing propriety. On a small reading table lies an assortment of marginalia, scraps of paper tucked between pages and folded letters half hidden in the bindings. A note, scrawled in delicate handwriting, reads, "Meet me near the west window after supper." And you imagine the clandestine excitement that has built around this message, the anticipation, the careful timing, and the unspoken thrill that accompanies secret correspondence. Even the act of returning a book becomes loaded, a deliberate pause, a shared glance, fingers brushing over the same page, and the quiet acknowledgement that a connection has been noted and returned. A cat, always present, curls atop a high shelf, observing with lazy curiosity as hands reach for books, fingers graze over spines, and the subtle choreography unfolds. The hum of quiet breathing, the scratch of quills, the soft rustle of pages, all of it forms a backdrop that amplifies every small interaction. A cough somewhere in the room reminds you of boundaries, decorum, and the ever-watchful eyes of landladies or more cautious boarders. Yet within these constraints, small gestures, an exchanged bookmark, a whispered comment, a subtle smile carry extraordinary weight. Sunlight slants through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drift lazily across the room. A low sigh escapes a reader as a particularly evocative passage is discovered, eyes lifting just enough to meet another's in fleeting recognition. Conversations, when they occur, are careful, measured, and often double as veiled inquiries about feelings, schedules, or secret rendezvous. In this library, the ordinary act of seeking knowledge becomes a stage for subtle performance, where intellect, curiosity, and quiet affection intertwine, weaving the invisible threads of connection that define the boarding house's hidden world of romance and gentle intrigue. You wander toward the music room, the faint echo of a piano scale drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how sound itself becomes a subtle tool, a language of its own, where the simplest melody can carry desire, attention, or unspoken invitation. So before your fingers hover over a piano key, let the scent of polished wood, rosin, and faint candle wax settle around you, layering the space with sensory cues that make every note feel intimate and consequential. A young woman practices an etude, her fingers gliding with careful precision, though occasionally hesitating as if measuring the space for unseen observers. Historians still argue whether boarding house music lessons were primarily educational or whether they served as socially sanctioned showcases, opportunities to display skill, elegance, and temperament to potential admirers. You notice a young man standing near the doorway, leaning against the frame, ostensibly reading a music sheet, but watching her hands more than the notes, the smallest tilt of his head betraying fascination. The air vibrates not just with sound, but with attention, expectation, and the subtle tension of unspoken interest. A metronome ticks steadily on a nearby table, its rhythm providing the silent heartbeat to the unfolding scene. You realize that even minor mistakes, a missed chord, a slightly offbeat note, invite gentle smiles or supportive gestures, creating fleeting moments of connection. On the piano bench lies a folded sheet of paper, edges soft with handling, its contents known only to two people who glance at it with shared secrecy. Perhaps a reminder of a meeting, a brief note of encouragement, or a playful critique meant to convey interest without overt declaration. Across the room, a harp rests against the wall, strings gleaming faintly in the sunbeams, a silent witness to countless rehearsals, small performances, and intimate lessons. A cat pads softly along the edge of the rug, weaving around ankles, a reminder that even in careful etiquette, chance and charm can intervene. Conversations between boarders are light, punctuated by musical references, quiet laughter, and the occasional whisper of shared opinion about a composer or technique, all while under the careful gaze of the landlady, who oversees the space with practiced discretion. The sunlight filters through a tall window, catching the gleam of polished keys and the sparkle of a small brooch pinned to a dress. Every gesture, fingers brushing the keys, hands reaching for sheet music, eyes lifting for a glance, is amplified by the room's acoustics, turning ordinary movements into signals, ordinary sounds into messages. Here in the music room, melody and intention mingle, creating a subtle symphony of attention, attraction, and curiosity. A carefully orchestrated dance where each note resonates with possibility, and every pause holds the weight of quiet, burgeoning romance. You wander into the parlour, the afternoon light soft against faded wallpaper, the faint tick of a clock echoing through the room. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how even a casual seating arrangement can carry the weight of subtle social signals. Which chair is claimed first, how backs are straightened, or how skirts brush the edge of a rug just so. So, before you sink into his seat, inhale the mingled scents of burning tallow candles, polished wood, and the faint musk of old upholstery, a perfume of time and anticipation. A group of boarders has gathered for tea, delicate porcelain cups clinking softly against saucers, hands fluttering over teaspoons in a rhythm that feels both deliberate and natural. Historians still argue whether these afternoon teas were intended merely for refreshment or whether they functioned as carefully crafted stages for courtship, where one's posture, tone, and attentiveness could reveal more than words ever could. You notice a young woman adjusting her shawl, eyes flicking toward a young man arranging sugar cubes, both of them performing a dance of gestures measured for charm and propriety. A small, handwritten invitation rests beside a teacup, its edges curling from repeated handling. Perhaps it's an invitation to a quiet walk in the garden, or a note slipped under a door, conveying interest without audacity. Even the clink of silverware becomes a signal, the deliberate reach for jam a tiny ritual of social interaction, the shared smile over a spilled teaspoon a minor triumph in connection. A cat, predictably curious, leaps onto the windowsill, tail curling as if to punctuate the moment, earning soft laughs and a glance that lingers just long enough to speak volumes. The fireplace, though unlit in the warm afternoon, anchors the room, a subtle symbol of comfort, warmth, and intimacy. Across from it, a folding screen partially obscures a small writing desk, papers stacked neatly, waiting for messages to be penned or read. A boarder retrieves a note, finger tracing the edges, and exchanges a barely perceptible glance with the intended recipient. The room is alive with careful observation. The way someone sips tea, tilts their head, or adjusts a cuff, each movement carrying potential significance in the delicate social calculus of boarding house romance. Sunlight slants through lace curtains, painting intricate shadows on the floor. Every rustle of fabric, every soft laugh, every subtle nod or cough becomes a part of the room's choreography. Conversations meander between light-hearted gossip, literary critique, and veiled inquiries about feelings, plans, and affections. Here, in the parlour, ordinary interactions become a playground for attention, curiosity, and subtle intimacy, where small gestures accumulate into a complex, ever-shifting web of connection, desire, and the quiet thrill of human observation. You drift into the dining hall just as the late afternoon light begins to stretch across polished floorboards, catching the edges of silverware and the rims of delicate china. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how every placement, every pause, every tilt of a head carries meaning. So before you reach for your seat, let your senses drink in the mingling scents of fresh bread, herbal tea, and the faint undertone of polished oak, comforting, grounding, and, in this peculiar boarding house world, quietly seductive. A group of boarders has gathered for the evening meal, and you watch as a young woman pours herself water, deliberately careful not to splash, as a young man across the table leans slightly forward, pretending to examine his plate, but stealing glances at her nonetheless. Historians still argue whether communal dining in boarding houses was primarily about nourishment, or whether it was a subtle arena for social positioning and courtship, where etiquette and the smallest gestures became loaded with meaning. You notice the rhythm of the room, the clink of knives, the soft scrape of plates, and the occasional shared laugh, a symphony of cues in which attention is as crucial as appetite. A folded napkin hides a tiny, handwritten note, edges creased from repeated handling, whispering secrets to those who know where to look. Someone reaches across to pass a dish, fingers brushing briefly over another hand, eliciting a suppressed smile, a minor act that might ripple through the room unnoticed by some, but thoroughly registered by those it matters to. Even a sneeze, a cough, or a misaligned chair can become an opportunity for gentle assistance, conversation, or a fleeting shared glance, each moment carrying potential for subtle connection. The head of the table bears a polished silver teapot, its reflective surface capturing not just the light, but snippets of interactions, quiet gestures, and fleeting expressions. A cat, as usual, whines between chairs, tail flicking, eliciting quiet laughter and distracted glances, a reminder that even the most mundane elements of the household contribute to the evolving social landscape. Conversation threads are woven delicately, a mix of playful banter, mild teasing, literary references, and veiled inquiries that test attentiveness, intelligence, and charm, all while maintaining the veneer of propriety expected in such a communal setting. Sunlight begins to fade, casting long shadows that stretch across the hall, softening features and blurring edges. Every tilt of the head, every careful placement of a fork, every measured laugh becomes a brushstroke in a larger tableau of boarding house life, where intimacy is practiced in the small details, curiosity is rewarded, and subtlety reigns supreme. Here in the dining hall, meals are not just about food. They are exercises in observation, gentle intrigue, and the slow, deliberate cultivation of attention, desire, and the quiet thrill of connection that defines the forgotten world of boarding house romance. You wander into the corridor on the upper floor, where sunlight filters through tall, narrow windows and dust motes drift lazily in its beams. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how even the architecture conspires to encourage interaction. Doors positioned to catch passing glances, landings that invite casual pauses, and staircases that seem engineered for fleeting contact. So, before you step forward, inhale the faint scent of polished banisters, worn carpet, and the ever-present hint of soap from the nearby washrooms. A boarder pauses at a door, pretending to adjust a hat or straighten a scarf, while another leans casually against the wall, fingers tracing the carved wood of the banister. Historians still argue whether these upper-floor corridors were primarily functional spaces for movement, or if they doubled as subtle arenas for observation and social maneuvering, where fleeting moments of eye contact, polite nods, or accidental shoulder brushes became exercises in charm and attention. You notice the choreography of steps, 1 foot forward, a casual glance left, a brush of fingers along the railing, all designed to appear accidental while communicating intent. Pinned to the wall near the stair landing is a small board, littered with announcements and hastily scribbled notes, reminders of supper, invitations to impromptu music sessions, or cryptic messages meant for particular boarders. You reach out to read one, a playful riddle about a shared secret, and can almost hear the muffled laughter that must have accompanied its placement. Even the smallest gesture, a touch of the hand to steady a book, a fleeting glance at a mirror, the careful adjustment of a sleeve, can carry layered meaning, signaling interest, testing reactions, or simply allowing attention to be acknowledged without words. A cat darts past, weaving under ankles and leaping onto the landing railing, its presence eliciting a chorus of gentle laughter. Steps on the stairs echo, adding a subtle rhythm to the unfolding scene, while the soft murmur of conversation drifts up from rooms below. Boarders pass one another, smiles exchanged in fractions of seconds, a shared nod, a whispered greeting, tiny sparks of interaction that might be forgotten by some but remembered in detail by those attuned to the subtle social currents of the boarding house. As the sun dips lower, shadows stretch across the corridor, softening edges and lending an air of intimacy to each gesture. You realize that in this seemingly mundane passageway, ordinary movement transforms into performance. Every pause, every glance, every carefully timed step contributes to the slow, deliberate cultivation of attention, curiosity, and quiet attraction. Here, the corridor is not merely a place to traverse, but a stage, a meeting ground, and a hidden theatre where the intricate dance of boarding house romance unfolds in whispers, glances, and unspoken understanding. You step into the garden just as the late afternoon sun softens, the scent of lavender and freshly turned soil curling around your senses. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how even a simple walk amid flower beds becomes a subtle social ritual. The choice of path, the angle of a glance, the careful avoidance or intentional crossing of another boarder's trajectory. So, before you trudge along the gravel, let the rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, and the occasional hum of bees settle into your awareness, a gentle soundtrack for quiet intrigue. A young woman tends to a patch of roses, fingers brushing the petals with deliberate care, while a young man lingers by the fountain, pretending to examine the water, but stealing glances at her hands, the curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her head. Historians still argue whether boarding house gardens were designed merely for recreation and fresh air, or if they functioned as carefully structured arenas for observation and interaction, where proximity and gesture conveyed far more than words ever could. You notice how a shared bench, a small arbour, or even a cluster of sunflowers can serve as staging points for fleeting encounters, chances for subtle conversation, a passing smile, or a quietly exchanged note. A folded slip of paper flutters in the breeze near the fountain, tucked between stones, hinting at an agreed-upon meeting, a playful dare, or an intimate observation. The placement is deliberate, requiring patience and timing to retrieve without being noticed by others, the very act amplifying anticipation. Even a casual watering of plants or pruning of leaves can carry implicit meaning, an invitation to linger, an opportunity to demonstrate skill, care, or attentiveness that others quietly register. A cat winds through the flower beds, tail curling, eliciting laughter and soft murmurs as boarders bend to stroke it, a convenient excuse for proximity that blends innocence with subtle social calculation. The sun casts long, warm shadows across the garden paths, highlighting textures of petals, gravel, and wrought iron fences. Conversations here are measured, whispered, punctuated by shared observations of flora or commentary on weather, light-hearted but loaded with layers of intent. A gentle brush of a hand against a watering can, a tilt of the head, a glance over the shoulder. All are gestures in a slow, intricate dance of connection. Here, in the garden, every natural feature, a stone, a bench, a trellis, becomes a potential stage for expression, every movement a signal of interest or curiosity, and every carefully timed pause a moment that might linger in memory. You feel the invisible choreography around you, the subtle weaving of attention, flirtation, and the delicate tension of shared secrecy, and you understand that even in the calm of greenery, the boarding house romance plays out with all the quiet drama and fascination of a carefully scripted performance. You drift toward the library, the heavy scent of parchment and ink greeting you before the polished oak doors even swing open. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how silence itself carries weight. The faint shuffle of pages, the soft creak of chair legs, the almost imperceptible sighs of concentration or suppressed curiosity. So before you settle into a seat, let the warmth of the room, the faint musk of old books, and the distant hum of conversation from the corridor mingle around you, layering the space with unspoken possibilities. A boarder perches at a corner table, pretending to annotate a passage, while another moves between shelves, selecting a volume with exaggerated deliberation, each action designed to draw attention without overt declaration. Historians still argue whether these boarding house libraries were intended solely for education or if they served as covert stages for social maneuvering, where knowledge, taste, and intellectual poise became signals in a subtle courtship ritual. You notice a folded note slipped between the pages of a well-thumbed novel, the handwriting small, precise, carrying a message meant only for the intended reader. A compliment, a query, or perhaps a playful dare that turns the mundane act of borrowing a book into a small adventure of intrigue. A cat stretches lazily along the windowsill, tail flicking in time with the gentle ticking of a clock, eliciting a quiet chuckle from someone passing by. The smell of ink and old glue seems almost intoxicating, creating an atmosphere where focus and attention intertwine with curiosity and fascination. Even the choice of which book to touch, the angle at which one reads, and the soft intakes of breath become meaningful gestures, subtle ways to invite conversation, recognition, or admiration. A pair of gloves lies forgotten on a table, a relic of a brief encounter, a shared space, or a delicate pause in the ongoing dance of proximity and notice. Sunlight filters through tall, leaded windows, casting intricate patterns on the worn rug and the spines of the books. A whispered exchange occurs behind a stack of volumes, brief, careful, measured. Words carried softly but weighty with meaning. Here, every rustle of a page, every tilt of the head, every glance over the rim of a pair of spectacles becomes part of the slow choreography of connection, flirtation, and discovery. In this library, knowledge and curiosity intermingle with human attention. Books become excuses, shelves act as barriers or meeting points, and silence transforms into a language of its own. Every gesture, every glance, every deliberate pause is a thread in the intricate tapestry of boarding house romance, weaving subtle connections that might only be fully appreciated in retrospect, yet leaving an indelible mark on the quiet, unfolding lives of those who call this shared world their temporary home. You wander into the music room, where the scent of varnished wood and a faint hint of candle wax lingers in the air, mingling with the soft echo of notes practiced and forgotten. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how a simple melody can draw attention, signal intention, or mask nervous anticipation. So before you approach the piano or the violin resting against a chair, take a deep breath and let the resonance of the room settle into your bones, the subtle vibrations threading through the polished floorboards. A young woman fingers the keys, fingers hovering above notes as if unsure, while a young man adjusts the bow of his violin, each movement deliberate, each hesitation a signal to the other, a silent conversation carried on sound and gesture rather than words. Historians still argue whether boarding house music rooms were designed primarily for artistic cultivation or as social theatres for courtship, where ability, patience, and timing became subtle measures of character and attentiveness. You notice the interplay of glances, the careful positioning of chairs to allow sightlines, and the deliberate pacing of practice pieces, each small detail choreographed to allow recognition and connection while maintaining the polite veneer expected in communal spaces. A music sheet, slightly dog-eared and scrawled with notes in the margin, rests beside the piano, a carefully placed invitation to linger, to play together, to share an experience that carries both intimacy and the thrill of discretion. Even the softest misplayed note or a momentary pause can become a point of connection, an opportunity for laughter, gentle correction, or mutual understanding. A cat whines between legs, tail flicking with the rhythm of a slow sonata, eliciting smiles and subtle hand touches that seem almost accidental but are carefully timed, adding texture to the performance of attention and charm. Sunlight through tall windows catches on polished surfaces, highlighting the edges of instruments, the sheen of hair and the curve of shoulders as hands hover over strings and keys. Soft hums, muted sighs, and the occasional cough punctuate the room's symphony, blending with the subtle soundtrack of human observation and interaction. Conversation is minimal, but the language of sound, gesture, and shared experience speaks volumes, offering glimpses into interest, admiration, or curiosity without breaking the decorum of the boarding house. In this music room, ordinary practice transforms into an elaborate dance of presence and perception. Notes resonate not just through the air, but across attentions, glances, and gestures, creating a shared rhythm of connection. Every deliberate pause, every subtle nod, every borrowed glance contributes to a complex tapestry of attraction and social choreography, where melody becomes both a backdrop and a bridge, carrying the delicate undertones of boarding house romance into the ears, hearts, and imaginations of those attuned enough to hear. You find yourself in the laundry room, a place you probably wouldn't have expected to carry much intrigue, yet here, among the gentle swish of linens and the scent of starch and soap, subtle social currents pulse beneath the surface. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how even chores, folding, ironing, or carrying baskets, can become exercises in observation, fleeting connection, and quiet flirtation. So, before you grasp the handle of a laundry basket, inhale the mix of clean cotton, warm steam, and a faint hint of lavender polish, grounding yourself in the tactile rhythm of domestic life. A young woman kneels over a basket of freshly pressed shirts, folding each with careful precision, while a young man leans against the wall, pretending to inspect the floorboards, yet his attention continually drifts toward her hands. Historians still argue whether boarding house laundry rooms were merely functional, or if they inadvertently became stages for subtle social signaling, where attention, dexterity, and timing were all silently assessed. Even a misplaced sock, a slightly wrinkled napkin, or the tilt of a collar can spark a shared smile, a whispered comment, or an innocent touch that lingers just long enough to be noticed. A crumpled note slips out from beneath a pile of linens, edges frayed and corners curled, hinting at secret messages or private rendezvous. Picking it up requires discretion. One false move, and the magic of anonymity is broken. Every gesture, handing over a folded towel, passing a basket in a narrow aisle, a brush of fingers when adjusting an apron strap, becomes a form of gentle communication, a language composed entirely of proximity and attention. The cat, always present, weaves through ankles and leaps onto counters, eliciting laughter and excuses for brief physical contact that might otherwise seem too forward. Sunlight streams through a high window, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden glow, softening edges and lending warmth to every interaction. Conversations here are minimal but rich in nuance, murmured observations about laundry techniques, shared exclamations over stubborn stains, or playful comments about the ever-present cat. Even in this seemingly mundane space, the choreography of glances, gestures, and timed pauses constructs a delicate network of attention, curiosity, and unspoken interest, weaving together moments that might seem trivial but carry emotional weight. In the laundry room, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Folding, stacking, and carrying transform into subtle tests of character, patience, and attentiveness. Every touch, every glance, every carefully timed movement contributes to the evolving tapestry of boarding house romance. Here, amidst the hum of machines and the scent of soap, human connection unfolds quietly, often unnoticed by the unobservant, yet fully appreciated by those attuned to the delicate rhythms of this shared intimate world. You shuffle into the communal dining room just as the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation swell around you. A space that smells of baked bread, simmering stew, and the faint tang of polished silver. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how seating arrangements, passing of dishes, and casual glances across the table become part of an unspoken social choreography. So before you grab a seat, let the hum of chatter, the scrape of forks, and the warmth of candlelight seep into your awareness, setting the stage for subtle games of attention and affection. A young woman reaches for the bread basket, pausing just long enough for the young man across the table to notice, their eyes meeting over the rim of a water glass. Historians still argue whether boarding house dining halls were merely functional spaces for nourishment, or if they doubled as social arenas where etiquette, table manners, and fleeting gestures became currency in the delicate economy of flirtation. You notice how the arrangement of chairs, the direction of a gaze, or the timing of a polite offer to pass salt can signal interest or test responsiveness, turning even mundane mealtime routines into nuanced communication. A napkin flutters off the edge of the table, an excuse for a brush of hands or a whispered remark that might otherwise seem contrived. The clink of a spoon against china punctuates laughter, creating rhythm in a room alive with observation and careful interaction. The cat, ever present in these communal spaces, weaves between legs, soliciting gentle touches and providing a socially acceptable excuse for proximity. Even a moment of shared silence, a bite taken in tandem, or a synchronized sip of tea can act as a subtle acknowledgement of attention, a small spark in the larger tapestry of connection unfolding at the table. Sunlight filters through tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished floor and glinting off utensils, enhancing the intimacy of each exchange. Conversations are layered, blending comments on the day's events with observations of those around, teasing remarks and carefully placed humor. The cadence of meals, the gentle rise and fall of voices, and the rhythm of movement all contribute to a subtle orchestration of attention, anticipation, and mutual recognition. In this dining hall, every gesture, from passing a plate to meeting a glance, transforms into a carefully calibrated act of social interplay. Ordinary mealtime becomes an arena where interest, curiosity, and attraction play out quietly but vividly, and the shared experience of food, warmth, and observation leaves an indelible imprint on the hearts and imaginations of those attuned to these delicate boarding house dances. Even amidst the clatter and chatter, connection hums beneath the surface, unseen but fully felt by those who know where to look. You wander into the attic, a space seldom visited, where the air is dry with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how shadows stretch long and every creak of the floorboard becomes a punctuation mark, making even the quiet act of exploration feel charged with potential. So, before you step past crates of old trunks and dusty rugs, let the warmth of the late afternoon sun slanting through a small window and the faint whisper of wind through the eaves settle around you like a gentle invitation. A trunk, slightly ajar, reveals bundles of letters tied with ribbon, yellowed with age, hinting at past romances that once breathed life into this very boarding house. Historians still argue whether these attics were intended merely for storage, or if they inadvertently preserved the secret emotional history of their inhabitants, the private whispers and tender glances folded into letters now forgotten by time. You lift one envelope, the paper rough beneath your fingers, the handwriting delicate and precise, and sense the thrill of connection bridging decades, a silent testimony to youthful longing and the subtle codes of flirtation practiced long before modern distraction existed. A feathered quill and a small inkpot sit beside the trunk, suggesting an improvised correspondence station, perhaps hastily abandoned in a moment of shyness or urgency. Even here, the mere act of writing carries unspoken meaning, the pressure of a pen on paper, the curl of a signature, the spacing of words, all small gestures conveying sentiment and attention in ways that spoken words could never match. A boarder's hat rests on a beam nearby, positioned as if it had been set down only moments ago, a marker of temporary presence, a signal to anyone curious enough to notice that someone else had been here first, engaging in this delicate dance of discovery. Sunlight catches dust motes drifting lazily, turning the attic into a soft, golden haze. The faint echo of a conversation from below reminds you that life continues elsewhere, yet up here, time seems slowed, preserved, intimate. Footsteps must be careful, movements measured, lest the fragile peace be disturbed. Even a simple stretch to reach a letter becomes a shared ritual if another hand happens to brush against yours, a fleeting, meaningful contact that can linger in memory long after it occurred. In this attic, forgotten objects and preserved letters transform into portals to emotion and connection. Every glance at a trunk, every rustle of paper, every careful step across worn floorboards becomes part of the boarding house's unspoken romance, a a quiet testament to the ingenuity, patience, and subtlety of human interaction. You realize that even in a place dedicated to storage and solitude, human desire and attention weave a hidden tapestry, waiting for the observant to discover, to linger, and perhaps to feel a little less alone. You make your way to the garden, where the late afternoon sun warms the stone paths and the scent of roses, lavender, and freshly turned soil mingles in the soft breeze. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how the placement of benches, trellises, and flower beds becomes a subtle map of social opportunity. So before you stroll along the winding paths, take a deep breath and let the colors, fragrances, and quiet rustle of leaves settle over you, a sensory reminder that even outdoor chores and leisure can carry quiet intrigue. A young woman tends the rose bushes, gloves dusted with soil, pausing to adjust a bloom just as a young man passes by, pretending to admire the sunlight filtering through the leaves, but clearly observing her movements. Historians still argue whether boarding house gardens were primarily practical, meant for beauty and sustenance, or if they functioned as deliberate stages for social interplay, where gestures of help, shared watering, and passing tools became gentle tests of attention and compatibility. You noticed the subtle ways hands brush when handing over a trowel, or how leaning slightly to examine a blossom allows for a glance that might linger just long enough to convey interest without breaking decorum. A small fountain burbles at the center of the garden, providing a backdrop of soft white noise, masking whispered words and shy laughter. Bees hum among the blossoms, and a cat darts through the hedges, prompting shared smiles and minor collisions that feel carefully orchestrated by fate. Even the choice of which flower to prune, the angle at which one holds the watering can, or the deliberate selection of a path through the garden becomes a form of quiet communication, a gentle dance of proximity, observation, and subtle invitation. Sunlight shifts as clouds drift, casting fleeting shadows across the stone paths and petals. Conversations are light, but the language of gesture, tucking hair behind an ear, adjusting a cuff, passing a basket of herbs, is rich with meaning. Every movement is weighted with attention, timing, and intention, allowing for subtle exchanges that can ignite curiosity or admiration without ever uttering a full confession. In this garden, labor and leisure intertwine with social interaction. The simple acts of tending, walking, or resting among the blooms become layered with nuance, creating a space where human connection can blossom in parallel with flowers. Here, the shared rhythm of sunlight, scent, and movement nurtures the slow growth of attention and affection, leaving a quiet but enduring imprint on those who traverse these paths together. You feel the delicate balance of care, observation, and unspoken communication all around, a gentle reminder that even nature can play accomplice to boarding house romance. You wander into the library, a hushed sanctuary of polished wood, inked parchment, and the faint, comforting aroma of aged paper mingled with beeswax polish. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how the arrangement of books, chairs, and reading desks creates a subtle framework for observation, proximity, and the gentle art of distraction. So, before you reach for a volume, let your fingers brush along the spines, hear the soft shuffle of pages, and feel the weight of centuries of knowledge and human secrets settling around you. A young woman leans over a table, carefully transcribing notes from a thick history tome, while a young man perches nearby, ostensibly lost in his own reading, though his gaze flickers toward her in the margins between paragraphs. Historians still argue whether boarding house libraries were merely repositories of knowledge or if they functioned as indirect arenas for social maneuvering, where shared interests in literature and intellectual exercise doubled as subtle courtship rituals. You notice how the choice of book, the turning of a page, even the gentle cough to mask attention becomes an instrument in this quiet dance of perception, signaling intellect, patience, and sometimes harmless curiosity. A crumpled bookmark slips from a shelf, revealing a hastily scribbled note tucked inside, half hidden in the margins, hinting at playful commentary, teasing, or even an invitation to join a whispered debate about a historical fact or a fictional plot. The placement is deliberate, the timing serendipitous, and the effect electric. One shared smile over inked words can ripple through the room with the quiet thrill of secrecy. A cat curls up atop a stack of atlases, eliciting laughter, a gentle touch, and a carefully disguised excuse to lean closer, all under the watchful scrutiny of the silent tomes surrounding them. Sunlight pours through tall, latticed windows, casting geometric shadows across the floor and creating pockets of warmth around select chairs and tables. Conversation is minimal, measured and intellectual, but glances, posture, and the soft echo of a page turning carry their own language. Even a fleeting gesture, offering a hand to steady a stack of books, pointing out a paragraph with the tip of a finger, becomes a deliberate act of shared attention. In this library, every book, every chair, every carefully considered glance transforms mundane scholarship into a stage for subtle connection. The space hums with the quiet energy of observation and interaction, where intellect, curiosity, and gentle social maneuvering intertwine. You sense that amid the whisper of pages, the scent of old paper, and the weight of accumulated knowledge. Boarding house romance thrives quietly, thriving in the careful choreography of attention, gesture, and shared intellectual curiosity, leaving an indelible impression that resonates long after the books are closed. You slip into the music room, where the scent of polished wood and varnish mingles with the faint resonance of lingering notes from previous practice sessions. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how the positioning of benches, pianos, and sheet music creates subtle opportunities for observation, closeness, and occasionally deliberate performance for an audience of one. So, before you press a key or lift a bow, let the soft echo of strings, the gentle hum of a piano, and the warmth of sunlight filtering through tall windows set the stage for another quiet chapter of boarding house intrigue. A young woman's fingers glide over ivory keys, producing a delicate melody that drifts across the room. A young man sits at a nearby table, ostensibly sketching in a notebook, but his eyes repeatedly drift toward her hands, the curve of her posture, and the rhythm of her playing. Historians still argue whether music rooms in boarding houses were strictly for study and recreation, or, if they were, more subtly, stages for the performance of attention, admiration, and early romantic signaling. Each pause, each crescendo, even a hesitant misplayed note, can be interpreted as opportunity, humor, or subtle invitation, depending on one's attentiveness. A bow rests against a violin case, strategically close to where two paths intersect, offering a gentle excuse for a shared movement, a fleeting touch, or whispered guidance on technique. Sheet music is occasionally misplaced, leading to moments of cooperative searching that allow fingers to brush or eyes to meet with casual innocence. Even the cat, now familiar with every corner of the boarding house, perches atop a piano, eliciting laughter, a hand to steady the instrument, and the perfect excuse for proximity. Sunlight reflects off polished wood, illuminating dust particles that float lazily in the air, creating a soft golden haze that wraps around the room. Conversations are sparse but rich in nuance, blending commentary on music, gentle teasing about missed notes, and subtle observations about the other's skills or demeanor. Timing is everything. A pause to adjust a sheet, a smile after a particularly lovely chord, or the shared inhalation of a breath between measures becomes a dialogue of attention and affection without a single word spoken. In this music room, ordinary practice transforms into a nuanced ballet of interaction. Each note played, each adjustment made, and each glance exchanged weaves a delicate tapestry of shared experience and unspoken sentiment. You feel the pulse of human connection in every measure, the quiet thrill of attention and observation, and the gentle crescendo of possibility that floats in the air long after the last note fades. Here, in the embrace of melody, boarding house romance finds its most lyrical expression, soft, subtle, and endlessly compelling. You wander down the dimly lit hallway, the wood floors creaking softly beneath your feet, the faint scent of lavender from a nearby chamber blending with the ever-present aroma of waxed wood and aged plaster. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how doors, windows, and shared thresholds serve as stages for quiet exchanges. The tilt of a head in a passing glance, a brush of a sleeve against yours, or the pause just long enough to notice who's coming and going. So before you round the corner, let the soft echo of footsteps and the muffled laughter from a distant room sink in, setting the subtle tension that makes even a corridor feel like a place of possibility. A young man leans against a doorframe, ostensibly adjusting his coat, while a young woman walks past carrying a basket of linens, pretending to focus on her task, but stealing glances when she thinks no one is watching. Historians still argue whether boarding house corridors were designed purely for practicality, or if their narrow intimacy inadvertently encouraged the kind of spontaneous interaction that fuels minor romances. You notice how timing and positioning matter, the moment to step aside, the choice to linger near a corner, or the decision to appear busy, all play into a delicate choreography of attention, curiosity, and tentative connection. A loose shutter rattles in the breeze, drawing your attention and providing a convenient excuse for a shared look, a chuckle, or a whispered observation. Even a misplaced rug or a slightly tilted picture frame can spark conversation, laughter, or a gentle nudge toward collaboration, turning the most mundane features of architecture into tools of subtle social engagement. Cats, always opportunistic, slink along the hall, brushing against ankles and prompting soft touches that are socially sanctioned, innocent, and yet charged with meaning. Light filters through a small, stained glass window, scattering colored patterns across the polished floor. Shadows shift with your movement, creating pockets of privacy in which small gestures, adjusting a scarf, holding a door, or offering a hand with a basket, become significant signals. Words are minimal, but posture, gaze, and timing carry weight, making each corridor crossing an opportunity to convey intent without overt declaration. In this hallway, every threshold, shadow, and incidental touch weaves into the ongoing story of connection. Ordinary passage transforms into a stage for subtle attention, curiosity, and flirtation, where human interaction is choreographed by observation, timing, and the shared understanding of a delicate social rhythm. You feel the quiet electricity in the space, the interplay of presence and awareness, and the gentle promise that even in fleeting moments, boarding house romance can bloom, unnoticed yet unforgettable. You step into the dining hall where the clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, and the warm aroma of stewing vegetables and fresh bread combine into a familiar, almost comforting symphony. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how the arrangement of tables, chairs, and serving stations subtly dictates interaction, proximity, and opportunity for both observation and mischief. So before you sit, let the soft chatter, the steam curling from bowls, and the gentle glow of candlelight settle around you, creating an atmosphere where human connection can quietly take root. A young woman carries a tray of bread, carefully navigating between tables, her eyes skimming the room, noticing where attention lingers and adjusting her path accordingly. A young man at the far end, pretending to read a menu, watches her with calculated patience, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Historians still argue whether dining halls were simply functional spaces or if they acted as stages for subtle social dynamics where seating arrangements, serving patterns, and even the choice of napkin placement could influence the development of relationships. You see how every gesture, pouring water, offering a second helping, sharing a laugh over a clumsy spill, becomes a quiet language of attention, observation, and playful courtship. A silver spoon slips from a tray, prompting a brief flurry of movement that allows hands to brush and eyes to meet in the briefest of acknowledgements. Laughter follows, soft and conspiratorial, carrying across tables in a way that is at once public and private, a shared moment that invites participation without requiring overt declaration. Even minor accidents, a toppled cup, a misaligned chair, become excuses for interaction, each small disruption weaving threads of connection into the fabric of daily routine. Light spills through tall windows, dancing across the polished wooden floors and highlighting the warmth of faces, hands, and eyes. Conversation hums around you, punctuated by subtle cues, a tilt of the head, a shared glance, a brush of a hand while passing a dish. Timing and subtlety are everything. The smallest gesture can ignite curiosity, amusement, or admiration, and the unspoken rules of decorum make each successful exchange all the more meaningful. In this dining hall, the mundane acts of nourishment and service transform into a theatre of subtle human interaction. Every movement, glance, and gesture becomes a brushstroke in the ongoing portrait of boarding house life, where connection, flirtation, and curiosity intertwine with daily ritual. You sense that amid the clatter of plates and the aroma of dinner, romance thrives quietly, in the corners of tables, in shared laughter, and in the careful choreography of attention that turns ordinary mealtimes into moments of discovery. You drift toward the attic, a dim, dusty space where sunlight pierces through small windows, casting long, golden beams across forgotten trunks, cobwebbed beams, and stacks of old letters. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how the hidden, semi-secret nature of the space creates perfect conditions for clandestine meetings, whispered conversations, and carefully folded confessions. So, before you step over a loose floorboard or brush aside a moth-eaten blanket, inhale the scent of old paper, mothballs, and sun-warmed wood, and let it wrap around you like a secret waiting to be uncovered. A young woman kneels by a trunk, sifting through worn clothing and diaries, her fingers trembling slightly as she retrieves a carefully folded note. A young man leans against a beam, pretending to examine a pile of old hats, while actually timing the moment to slip closer and catch a glimpse of her reaction. Historians still argue whether attic spaces were purely practical, meant for storage and retreat, or if they became informal arenas for subtle courtship, where isolation, secrecy, and the thrill of discovery heightened emotional intensity. You notice how proximity, timing, and the act of sharing, even over a brief glance at a handwritten note, becomes a deliberate dialogue, allowing affection to blossom in hushed tones and whispered exchanges. A moth flutters past, startling both of them just enough to trigger a shared laugh, a touch on the arm, and an awkward shuffle closer together. The creak of floorboards punctuates the moment, and shadows from the rafters twist across the scene, creating a private theatre in which gestures are amplified. Even mundane objects, a discarded glove, a hat perched jauntily on a trunk, a ribbon, serve as instruments of interaction, excuses for contact, or tokens of attention. Sunlight shifts, revealing hidden dust motes sparkling like tiny stars. Every glance, every careful move carries weight. Offering a hand to steady a stack of letters, sharing a folded note, or adjusting a scarf becomes an act of intimacy in the semi-darkness. Conversation is minimal, punctuated by whispered jokes or gentle teasing, but the shared experience of secrecy, discovery, and slight risk infuses the moment with quiet electricity. In this attic, the ordinary objects of storage become catalysts for human connection. Each letter, each trunk, each shadowed corner transforms the space into a stage for subtle observation, tentative flirtation, and secretive camaraderie. You feel the thrill of being present in a world that is both private and shared, where boarding house romance reaches its most delicate and exciting form, quietly entwining curiosity, affection, and the soft exhilaration of the hidden. You finally make your way to the garden, a walled sanctuary of fragrant blooms, climbing ivy, and soft, uneven paths that curve around hidden benches and small fountains. You probably won't survive long here without noticing how the natural environment, with its nooks, shaded alcoves, and unexpected turns, encourages lingering conversations, casual touches, and subtle demonstrations of attentiveness. So, before you follow the winding path, breathe in the mix of damp earth, flowering petals, and sun-warmed stone, letting the ambient sounds of birdsong and distant laughter envelop you in the perfect prelude to evening reflection. A young woman tends a small patch of herbs, carefully trimming and rearranging sprigs while humming a barely audible tune. A young man pauses nearby, ostensibly inspecting the garden, but his gaze follows her movements, noting the delicate precision of her hands, and the faint smile that appears when she thinks no one is watching. Historians still argue whether boarding house gardens were merely ornamental or if they served as subtle theatres for social interaction, where labour, leisure, and shared space intertwined to create opportunities for observation, conversation, and unspoken connection. You see how the act of helping with a leaning plant, offering a bundle of herbs, or sharing a moment of laughter over a bee's intrusion can become meaningful exchanges, rich with context and gentle intimacy. A fountain splashes softly in the background, masking the shuffle of feet and the slight rustle of clothing as two paths converge by chance, or perhaps by careful planning. Birds flit between branches, creating brief distractions and excuses for shared attention, while a stray cat weaves between flower beds, eliciting laughter, a bend to pet it, and the perfect opportunity to linger nearby. Even minor incidents, a toppled watering can, a misaligned bench, or a slightly crooked trellis, spark interaction, turning the garden into a dynamic stage for curiosity, care, and subtle courtship. Sunlight softens as afternoon shifts into early evening, casting long shadows across winding paths and illuminating the gentle sway of flowers. Conversations are quiet and intermittent, punctuated by smiles, nods, and fleeting touches that communicate care and attentiveness without a single word. Timing and spatial awareness guide each exchange. The right moment to extend a hand, share a laugh, or adjust a sleeve transforms the mundane into an act of human connection, a gentle ballet of observation and response. And now, as you meander through the last corners of the garden, it's clear that every aspect of the boarding house, from library to dining hall, attic to garden, has quietly orchestrated this elaborate dance. Every glance, gesture, and whispered word has contributed to a web of subtle connection, curiosity, and gentle romance. You feel the echo of each shared moment, the soft rhythm of attention and affection, and the tender energy that has pulsed through the house from morning to dusk. And as the shadows lengthen, the air cools, and the scents of earth and flower mingle, you sense that even as the day ends, the gentle thrill of discovery and connection lingers softly, like a memory tucked in the corners of your mind, comforting and enduring. Now slow your breathing, let your eyes rest on the soft colours fading with the evening, and imagine the quiet, continuous heartbeat of a world where simple gestures and gentle attentiveness could spark lasting bonds. Remember that every laugh shared, every accidental touch, every glance unnoticed by others is part of the secret language that has made boarding house romance both ordinary and magical, always quietly thriving beneath the surface of daily life. The day is folding in on itself now, and you feel the soft release of tension from hours of quiet observation. Every corridor you've crossed, every room you've glimpsed, every garden path wandered has been infused with gentle human connection, subtle gestures, and the tiny sparks of curiosity that lead to affection. Let your mind drift with the evening air, carrying the scents of old paper, polished wood, flowers, and warm earth, settling softly like a lullaby over your thoughts. Imagine the boarding house growing still. The library lights dim, the piano's echo fades, the garden cools under a gentle shadow, and even the attic, with its secret notes and hidden treasures, feels the calm of dusk. You might hear the soft flutter of curtains, the whisper of a page turned in the quiet study, or the distant laughter of those who linger a little longer in familiar spaces, all blending into a background hum that is both comforting and ephemeral. It's a world you've inhabited for a few hours, but one whose quiet rhythm and tender interactions linger in memory, like a soft, secret smile shared in passing. You feel the warmth of connection without urgency, the thrill of discovery without pressure, and the gentle assurance that even in the smallest, most ordinary moments, there is room for curiosity, attentiveness, and quiet affection. Let the rhythm of these boarding house days, the slow pulse of gentle interactions and the soft glow of shared experience ease your mind. The rooms, the corridors, the garden, they all exist now in a suspended, tender calm, inviting you to exhale, relax, and sink into the comfort of observation and imagination. Now, Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let your thoughts drift through the quiet world of boarding house life. Feel the lingering warmth of laughter, the brush of unseen hands, and the gentle, enduring pulse of connection that persists even as the day ends. Close your eyes and let the house, its stories, and its subtle romances lull you into calm, knowing that every whispered glance and tender gesture has found its place, softly remembered and quietly cherished.